Deep forests around the world have long been home to stories of things lurking just beyond the trees. From a ranger torn apart in Oregon to hunters found face down beside giant footprints in British Columbia, the forests are keeping secrets. A lake stirs with shadows, skiers lose time in the Alps, and a trapper's final words vanish in the Siberian snow. Even truckers are watched from behind the pines on silent roads. In this video, we'll explore 6 chilling encounters with an unknown presence, each one a brush with something large, silent, and impossible to explain. On October 3rd, 2016, deep inside the restricted sector of Redthorn Grove Forest in Lincoln County, Oregon, a senior park ranger named Dale Whitmore began his final solo patrol. Dale had spent nearly 25 years working in remote forests. He had seen storms twist trees like paper and had tracked lost hikers through snow-covered hills. People in the nearby town called him quiet, calm, and dependable. He had never taken a single sick day and rarely spoke of fear. That morning, Dale was assigned to sweep a stretch of restricted woodland not open to the public. The path was rough and unmarked. The area was mostly used for emergency fire routes and had thick trees, heavy moss, and very little sunlight. His report showed that he entered the zone just after 8 a.m. He carried a radio, a flashlight, a GPS, and a day pack with survival tools. Hours passed with no problems, but something changed around midday. GPS data later showed Dale slowing down and stopping often, as if unsure where to go. He later claimed he began to feel watched. The usual forest sounds had gone silent. There were no birds, no wind, just heavy air and long shadows. His flashlight had to be turned on, even though it was barely past noon. At 3:40 p.m., Dale's radio was picked up briefly by another ranger station. The transmission was static-filled. It ended without a full message. Search logs show no one responded, since the short signal did not trigger concern at the time. By 6 p.m., Dale stumbled out of the woods, heading toward the ranger base with his shirt ripped open and his back torn. Deep gashes stretched across his shoulders and spine, as if from claws. His hands were scraped, his left boot was missing, and his pack was gone. Other rangers rushed him to safety. He did not speak clearly, but kept looking behind him, as if expecting something to follow. His flashlight was not with him. Later that night, it was found still glowing in the trees. It was hanging from a broken branch nearly 15 feet above the ground. Back at the attack site, teams found the path torn apart. Small trees were snapped off at chest height, and wide prints were pressed deep into the mud. Each footprint measured almost twice the length of a grown man's boot. Claw marks had stripped bark from nearby trees, reaching higher than any known bear could reach. This was not a place Dale had ever reported as dangerous before. No large animals had been tagged in the area. The missing gear was never recovered, and the marks on the trees did not match local wildlife. The next morning, Dale submitted his resignation. He refused to explain and avoided all further contact with park staff. He moved out of the region by the end of the month. The officials never gave a reason for the event. The area remains closed. Dale left the ranger station without answering questions. He did not fill out the usual exit paperwork or complete his final report. Those who knew him said he seemed like a different man. His calm nature was gone, replaced by fear that stayed in his eyes. He avoided the main roads, packed only what he needed, and drove away without telling anyone where he was going. No one saw or heard from him again. The ranger team who had found him were unsettled by the sight. They had never seen such damage in the woods. Rangers were used to tracking animals, reading the signs left behind, but this was not like anything they had studied. The trees were broken high off the ground, as if snapped by something tall. The ground showed no signs of a chase, but the large footprints were spaced far apart, as if whatever made them walked in long, heavy strides. The blood trail where Dale had escaped showed signs of a fast, violent struggle. His boot and torn pieces of his uniform were scattered across a small clearing, yet no bones or hair samples were found. The only other clue was the flashlight, still glowing when they picked it from the tree. The officials filed a short internal report. It labeled the event as an animal encounter. They did not name what kind of animal. No news outlet covered the story. The patrol logs were edited to show the route as normal. Rangers were told not to return to that part of Redthorn Grove unless under direct order. Behind the scenes, rumors spread. Some believed Dale had seen something that was not supposed to exist. Others thought the area had been kept off limits for a reason. A few rangers admitted they had always felt uneasy in that section of the forest. They spoke of strange sounds at night and the feeling of being watched without reason. New rangers sent to the area were told to avoid certain paths. Signs were quietly added at trailheads, warning of falling branches and unstable ground. These signs were never mentioned in public reports. Within months, the damaged trees had begun to regrow, and the footprints had faded. But the story remained among the staff. They called it the night something walked the forest that should not have been there. Dale's name was never removed from the records, but no one spoke it out loud. Years later, hikers reported hearing crashing sounds near that part of the forest. Some said they found branches placed in strange patterns. Others claimed to see movement where there should have been none, but no one ever found proof. The forest remains quiet. The area around Dale's last patrol is still closed. No animals were ever tagged there. No new trails were marked, and no one ever found out what followed him that day. The truth stayed buried, just like the footprints beneath the growing moss. On June 12, 2016, a group of 5 friends arrived at a remote campsite near Oxbow Lake in St. Louis County, Minnesota. They were all nature lovers in their mid-20s, used to weekend getaways far from towns and cities. The group included Kevin, the one who planned the trip, Sarah, who brought her fishing gear, Mark, a wildlife photographer, Lila, a quiet hiker who enjoyed writing in her journal, and Josh, who had never camped before but came along for the experience. They reached the site after a long drive and a short hike through thick woods. The lake was calm, surrounded by tall pines and distant hills. It was early summer, and the air was warm, filled with the usual hum of insects and birdsong. The friends set up tents, cooked simple meals, and spent the first day swimming and relaxing by the shore. That night, they sat around a small fire, talking quietly until they grew tired. One by one, they went into their tents. The wind was light, and the water lapped softly against the shore. Everything felt normal, but just before dawn, Kevin woke up suddenly. It was silent, not quiet, completely silent. No birds, no insects. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. He stepped out of his tent and looked around. Mark was already up, standing at the edge of the lake, pointing toward the water. The others joined them, standing close together. The surface of the lake rippled in strange patterns, but there was no wind, no falling branches, and no animals nearby. The ripples moved in wide circles, as if something large had passed just beneath the water. Then, a dark shadow glided under the surface. It was long, wider than any fish or animal they had seen before, moving too smoothly to be driftwood or debris. A low vibration passed through the ground, strong enough to make the smaller waves rock the group's canoe gently on the shore. They backed away slowly, unsure what they were seeing. The sun had not fully risen yet, and everything around them felt wrong. Just as they turned toward camp, strange footprints appeared in the wet mud. They were wide and long, more than twice the length of a person's foot, with an odd spacing that looked unnatural. Mark bent to take photos, but before he could snap a picture, a low, deep growl came from the tree line across the lake. The sound was not loud, but it rumbled in their chests. No movement came from the woods, but all 5 of them felt something was watching. Frozen in place, the group stood for several moments. Then, Kevin led them quickly back toward the tents. No one spoke. They grabbed only their most important gear and quietly made their way back toward the trail they had come from. None of them knew what they had just witnessed, but they all felt the same thing. Something powerful and unknown was hiding beneath that lake, and it did not want them there. The 5 friends left the lakeside in silence, walking quickly through the early morning light. The forest still felt strange. There were no sounds from birds or animals. Even the wind stayed still, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. Kevin kept glancing behind them, but nothing followed. Still, the pressure in the air never faded. By the time they reached the trailhead, the group was exhausted. Nobody had spoken much. Sarah's hands were shaking. Josh looked pale and unsteady. Mark clutched his camera bag tightly, though he had not taken any photos since the moment the shadow moved under the water. Lila stayed in the back, constantly turning around to scan the woods. Later that day, after reaching their cars, they reported what they had seen to a nearby ranger station. A pair of rangers was sent out to inspect the site. The group waited at a local lodge while the officials went to investigate. The rangers returned later that evening. Their report mentioned nothing unusual. They said the ripples were likely caused by fish or a large beaver. The prints were described as natural formations or possibly part of a prank. The strange sound was blamed on wind echoing through the trees. But the group knew what they had felt. The silence, the shape in the water, the tracks in the mud. None of it matched what the rangers claimed. The group left town the next morning and promised not to go back to that place again. In the weeks that followed, each of them felt different. Sarah stopped going camping. Josh sold his hiking gear. Kevin spent hours researching lakes and strange creatures online, but he found nothing solid. Lila began having trouble sleeping and started writing about their experience in a notebook she never showed anyone. Mark never looked at the photos he had taken on the trip. He said some memories were better left untouched. Months passed, and summer turned to fall. Locals near the lake started telling stories. Some said they had seen something standing still in the mist. Others spoke of strange noises at night or ripples on the water, even when the surface was calm. A few said their dogs refused to go near the shoreline anymore. A man who lived nearby claimed to find more large tracks along the northern edge of the lake. He tried to take photos, but by the time he returned with a camera, the marks had faded. Some people began to avoid the area altogether, calling it unlucky or cursed. Even though there were no more reports of harm, the memory of that morning stayed with the 5 friends. They never went camping together again. They stayed in touch, but the bond they had before the trip never returned. Something had changed that day by the lake, something none of them could explain. And at Oxbow Lake, where the water still moved slowly and the trees grew tall, the silence returned each night just before sunrise. Locals learned not to ask questions. They just stayed away. On October 9th, 2014, 3 lifelong friends set out into the dense wilderness of northern British Columbia, Canada. Their names were Thomas Reed, Matthew Cole, and Jared Lewis. All 3 were experienced hunters, having grown up in nearby towns where weekends were often spent in the woods. Thomas was the oldest, a former forestry worker with a quiet voice and steady aim. Matthew was a local guide who knew the land well. Jared, the youngest, worked at a hardware store but spent every free moment outdoors. Each year they took one long trip together. This time, they chose a remote region near an unmarked creek deep within the forest. Their plan was simple: hike in for 2 days, set up camp, and track deer or moose for another 3. They packed rifles, food, and warm gear. The weather had turned cold early that year, and snow had already touched the highest ridges. No cell signal reached the area. They used radios to stay in contact and left a map with family just in case. After setting camp near a shallow stream, the group explored the thick brush, noting signs of animal movement and marking their trail with bright tape. The first 2 days passed quietly. They caught no game, but their spirits remained high. A campfire each night kept them warm, and the sound of running water helped them sleep. By the third morning, everything changed. When rangers arrived after a missed check-in, they found all three men lying face down near the creek. Their arms were stretched straight forward, as if they had tried to reach for something just out of sight. The scene was strange. There were no wounds on the bodies, no blood, and no sign of an attack in the usual sense. The rifles the hunters had carried were found close by, not scattered, but carefully stacked in a triangle. Even stranger, their boots were missing. All six were later found neatly placed several meters away, lined up side by side with the soles spotless, untouched by the mud that covered the rest of the area. No human tracks led to or from the site. However, the ground surrounding the bodies told a different story. Dozens of massive footprints covered the soft earth. Each one was nearly 2 feet long, spaced in long strides and pressed deep into the ground. The shape of the prints looked nothing like that of a bear, moose, or any local animal. The area was quiet, too quiet. No birds called, no insects buzzed. Even the trees seemed still. Above the scene, just a few steps into the tree line, something else waited. A broken ring of thin branches, twisted into a wreath-like shape, hung from a low limb. It swung gently, though no wind touched the trees. The search team stood frozen. The scene did not feel natural. It felt like something had watched them place every item, had made every print, and waited just beyond where the eye could see. One of the rangers stepped toward the branch ring hanging above the clearing. As he reached up, the air shifted. The temperature dropped suddenly, as if something cold had passed through the trees. He lowered his hand and backed away without touching it. None of them spoke, but each felt it. The silence was too heavy, the stillness too deep. Something about the place pushed them to leave. The investigation began quickly. Forensic teams were called in to examine the scene. The bodies were transported with care, and specialists examined the surrounding area. Nothing showed signs of natural causes. No bruises, no scratches, no defensive marks on any of the three hunters. Their expressions were calm, not twisted in fear or panic. They looked like they had simply fallen forward and stopped breathing. The footprints were photographed and measured. Each was the same shape and depth. The stride between them suggested something very tall. Wildlife experts were called, but none could match the prints to any known species. They said a bear would have left claw marks and disturbed the area far more. These prints were precise, clean, and too big. The rifles were tested. All three were unloaded. Each had a full magazine but no chambered rounds. They were placed on the ground with care, not dropped in a panic. Someone, or something, had taken time to stack them. The boots were also clean inside and out, which made no sense given the muddy ground. It was like they had been removed before the men entered the clearing. The broken wreath hanging from the branch was collected. No rope or tool was used. The branches were twisted and bent by hand, or by something with the strength to shape them without snapping. Its placement above the bodies was too exact to be random. Investigators marked it as unusual, but offered no further comment. After a week, the official report was filed. It listed the cause of death as unknown. Wildlife involvement was mentioned as a possibility, but there was no evidence to support it. No toxic substances were found. No natural hazards like gas pockets or lightning were present. The deaths remained unexplained. Locals in nearby towns heard the news and began sharing stories. Some spoke of lights seen in the woods. Others described strange sounds at night, deep and slow, like breathing. A few mentioned seeing shadows between the trees, always too far to see clearly, but always too large to be a man. Hunters stopped visiting the area. Guides refused to take clients there. The creek became a place of silence. People said the air changed when you stepped close, like it was watching. No animals returned. Even the insects stayed away. Years later, the prints were still discussed in hushed voices. The three hunters were remembered not only for how they died, but for the way the forest kept its secret. Something had come to that clearing, and whatever it was, it had not wanted to be found. On February 2nd, 2003, Deep in the remote stretches of the Siberian taiga, a lone trapper named Mikhail Volkov set up camp near a frozen stream. He had lived most of his life in the harsh winters of this region, making a living through fur trading and wilderness tracking. Mikhail was in his early 60s, quiet and strong, with years of experience surviving the forest alone. He preferred solitude, often spending weeks without seeing another person. His log cabin stood deep among thick trees, far from villages or main roads. This was a place he knew well, a place he trusted. The last time anyone heard from him was through a brief radio message sent to a contact in a nearby settlement. He mentioned strange noises outside the cabin, sounds he had never heard before. He described slow, heavy steps and deep growls that did not belong to any wolf or bear. After that message, silence followed. Days passed, then weeks. Concerned, a small team of forest rangers and volunteers traveled by snowmobile to reach the site. When they arrived, the forest around the cabin was still. A thin column of smoke rose from a nearly dead fire. The snow was undisturbed around the cabin entrance. No signs of a struggle, no sign of Mikhail. Inside, the cabin was neat. His supplies were stacked in place. A kettle sat above warm ashes. His rifle was in the corner, untouched. On the small table near the window, there was a notebook. The cover was worn, its pages bent and marked by cold fingers. The handwriting inside grew worse the deeper they read. The first pages talked about the weather, hunting routes, and animal track. Then the tone changed. The next entries described how he began hearing footsteps each night. He said they circled the cabin but never came close. He started seeing shapes between the trees, tall shapes that stayed still for hours. One line said he saw something with wide shoulders standing beyond the edge of the clearing. The footprints around the cabin were wide and deep, too large for any animal known to the region. They never led to or away from the trees, just around the cabin itself. The last page held a few lines written in uneven script. Only one line remained clear at the bottom. It said the thing was waiting in the dark, closer than the trees. The final letters trailed off into smudges as if written in fear. Outside, the snow around the clearing was flat. His tracks led toward the nearby frozen stream. Then they stopped. No more impressions, just a blank patch as if the snow had never been touched. There was no wind that night, no snowfall, no signs of a fall or struggle. His belongings were left behind, his clothes and food untouched. But Mikhail Volkov was gone, leaving only his notebook and a heavy silence that settled back over the forest. The searchers spent the next day combing the surrounding area. They followed the frozen stream for over a mile, but there were no further tracks. The snow was smooth and untouched, except for faint drag marks along the edge of the trees. These marks led nowhere, fading quickly, as if erased by something moving too lightly for its size. There were no claw prints, no broken branches, only the silence and cold that pressed in on every side. The notebook was packed up and taken by the lead ranger. It was passed along to a local investigator who photographed the pages and submitted them for review. Experts studied the writing but could not explain the fear behind the words. The shaky handwriting grew worse in each line, almost unreadable at the end. No known animal in the region could match the description or behavior detailed in the last entries. No official cause was written in any report. Mikhail's disappearance was added to a short list of missing persons from the deeper parts of the Siberian forest. No foul play was suspected. Nothing was stolen or damaged. Wildlife officials gave statements saying it was likely that he had fallen through ice or been taken by wolves. But none of these reasons matched the fact. The cabin was secure, the snow was not disturbed, no blood was found, and wolves did not circle cabins without leaving prints or signs of a kill. Locals began to speak quietly about the forest. Stories that had once been old tales came back into conversation. People remembered other missing trappers from years before, always in the same area. Some told of tall shadows between the trees, never seen clearly, but always felt. One man said the forest sometimes watched people, and that if someone listened closely, They would hear breathing just past the edge of the light. After Mikhail vanished, no one stayed near that part of the taiga. The firewood hut near his cabin was left full. The snowmobiles that came to search turned back without revisiting the clearing. Even the logbook at the ranger station had a line added saying the route was unsafe during winter. No new camps were built, no new traps were laid. The notebook remained locked away. The last page, with its broken words and uneven letters, stayed burned in the mind of everyone who read it. Those who saw it could not forget the final message. It was not loud, it was not detailed, but it felt real in a way no report or guess could explain. In time, the trees grew thicker around the cabin. Snow covered the roof. The wind made the same slow sounds it always had, but something had changed. The clearing did not feel empty, it felt watched, and those who remembered what was found there never returned. Mikhail Volkov was never found. The snow erased what little was left, and the taiga held its secret once again. On February 11, 2017, deep in the Swiss Alps, 3 cross-country skiers began a planned weekend trip through the snowy mountain path near the Vaud region. Their names were Lucas Frey, a local guide with years of alpine experience, David Heller, a university student studying environmental science, and Thomas Müller, a tourist from Germany who had skied several routes before. The group was well prepared, carrying food, map, cold weather gear, and communication equipment. Their goal was to complete a long trail and return by the 3rd day. The first part of their trip went as expected. They followed a known path along the mountain ridge and camped in a sheltered area between thick pines. The weather remained cold but calm until late into the second night. Without warning, strong winds and heavy snowfall swept across the mountains. The blizzard was fast and powerful, blocking all visibility and forcing the skiers to stay inside their tents. Hours later, a search team began tracking their route after they failed to check in. It took 3 days before the skiers were found. They were discovered wandering a narrow pass far from their last known position. All 3 were barefoot, covered in light snow, and missing layers of clothing. Their faces looked pale and tired. Their skin showed signs of bruising and shallow scrapes, but there were no serious injuries. Rescue workers guided them back to safety. None of the men could explain what had happened. They had no memory of the storm, no knowledge of how they got separated, and no idea why their gear was missing. Medical teams treated them for cold exposure and confusion. Tests showed no signs of brain injury or illness. The rescue team returned to the original campsite to gather their belongings. What they found raised more questions. Large footprints circled the tents. Each print was wide, long, and deeper than what any human boot could have made. The prints followed no pattern and disappeared into the woods. Nearby, rescuers found branches snapped and placed into shapes on the ground. Some were crossed into X-like forms. Others were bent in arches. These patterns looked unnatural, almost like signs meant to mark paths or boundaries. The rescue team also noted that no gear or skis were at the campsite, as if the skiers had walked out into the storm without using any of their supplies. The forest around the site felt quiet and still. Trees stood tall, but there were no animal signs, no tracks besides the large ones, and no sound of birds or wind. Those who had seen many winters in the Alps said they had never come across anything like it. The mountain path remained unchanged, but something about the clearing felt wrong. Though the skiers survived, the hours during the storm were a complete mystery. What happened between the first snowfall and their return could not be explained. Their journey had ended, but the real story was just beginning. The 3 men were taken to a hospital in Lausanne for more checks. Doctors tried to understand why they had no memory of the blizzard or the hours they had been missing. Their minds seemed clear, but the missing time could not be explained. They were quiet during the interviews, often looking down or staring out windows. None of them gave answers that helped. Back at the trail, mountain police marked the area around the campsite for more study. They took pictures of the footprints and strange shapes made from branches. Experts were called to look at the prints. They were longer than any animal track common to the region and showed a wide heel and 5 toes. No claw marks were found. The snow around them was not packed down, as it would be if someone had walked in heavy boots. The prints were deep and clean. Officials tried to say the shapes in the snow were caused by falling limbs or wind, but searchers knew they had not seen anything like it. The way the branches were placed looked too exact. The forest was still. Even days later, no birds returned to the area. The skiers were released after a week, but they did not return to the mountains. Lucas moved away to work in another part of Switzerland. David stopped skiing. Thomas went back to Germany and never contacted the others again. Their gear was never found. Search teams went back to look, but no skis, jackets, or bags were located. It was as if the snow had taken everything away. A local mountain guide who knew the trail said older stories told of strange events during storms. Some said people heard heavy footsteps or saw shadows moving through the trees. No one ever proved these stories were true, but after what happened, more hikers stopped visiting that part of the Alps. The mountain path was closed for several weeks. Signs warned of falling trees and dangerous snow. When it reopened, fewer people used it. Those who did said the trail felt colder than before. The trees seemed taller. The wind sounded like low breathing. Scientists who studied the case said the cold and shock had likely caused memory loss. They believed the men had left their tents confused, removing gear by mistake, but they had no answer for the size of the footprints or the patterns on the ground. Years later, the skiers did not speak about what happened. When asked, they gave short answers or said they did not remember. But each time winter came, none of them returned to the mountains. The snow had covered most signs of that night, but the photos of the prints and the shapes remained. Some people still believe something was out there that night, something tall, something silent, something that waited just beyond the edge of the storm. On January 9th, 2021, a strong winter storm swept across the Pacific Northwest, turning winding mountain highways into narrow paths surrounded by thick walls of snow. Carl Jensen, a long-haul truck driver from northern Idaho, was behind the wheel of his 18-wheeler, delivering building materials to a rural site in Oregon. Carl had spent over 2 decades on the road. He was used to snow, wind, and long hours spent alone in the cab of his truck. He liked the silence of empty highways and rarely took breaks unless absolutely necessary. That night, however, the storm made everything feel different. The wind howled louder than usual, and the snow fell faster than the wipers could clear it. As the road climbed through pine-covered hills, Carl noticed the temperature dropping fast. Ice was beginning to form along the edges of the windshield. His dashboard lights flickered for a second, and a warning message blinked across the screen. Not wanting to risk a breakdown in such a remote spot, he slowed his truck and pulled over to the shoulder. There were no lights on the road, no towns nearby, and no other vehicles in sight. Only tall pine trees lined both sides of the road, standing dark and still beneath the falling snow. Carl stepped out of the cab and pulled his jacket tighter against the wind. The air was sharp and bitterly cold. He walked slowly to the front of the truck, trying to check the engine. As he leaned over the hood, something made him stop. He felt a strange pull, as if something unseen was watching from the forest. He turned his head and lifted his flashlight. There, just beyond the road's edge, inside the tree line, a large shape stood still. It was taller than a man, wide at the shoulders, and did not move. The figure was almost part of the shadows, dark and quiet. 2 glowing eyes reflected the light back at him. They were far apart, set high and steady. The shape did not step forward or back. It just stood there, silent and unmoving, as if waiting. Carl stayed frozen in place. The wind had dropped. The snow was no longer loud. Everything around him had gone still. He slowly lowered the flashlight and stepped back. He looked at the ground for signs of any animal, hoping to see the rounded prints of a bear or the narrow tracks of a deer. but what he saw were wide impressions pressed deep into the snow. They were shaped like feet, long and flat, with no claw marks. Each print was spaced far from the next, as if made by something that moved with heavy, wide strides. Carl backed away toward the truck. His breath hung in the air, but he made no sound. The shape in the trees still had not moved. Its eyes kept watching. The prints did not lead toward the road or away from it. They stopped at the edge of the trees, as if the thing had appeared from nowhere. The ground between the truck and the forest was untouched. The trees behind the figure stood close together, too narrow for something that size to pass through easily. Yet there it was. Back inside the cab, Carl locked the door and turned on the engine. The headlights lit the road ahead, but nothing showed between the trees anymore. The figure was gone. The forest looked empty again. Still, the air felt thick, and the sense of being watched did not leave. Carl stayed parked for several minutes, unsure if he should continue. When he finally pulled back onto the road, he kept checking his mirrors, waiting for something to reappear. As the truck rolled forward into the snow and darkness, the pines lining the road seemed taller than before. The silence around them held tight, as if keeping secrets too old to name. Carl drove through the snow-covered highway, but the forest on both sides no longer felt empty. The memory of the figure stayed with him. Every few minutes he looked at the mirrors or glanced at the trees, expecting to see something standing still again. The road twisted through hills, and even though there were no signs of danger ahead, he felt as if something was following him without sound. He reached a small rest stop nearly 2 hours later. The place was quiet and empty, with snow piled high around the benches and trees. Carl parked the truck and left the engine running. He stayed inside the cab, holding the steering wheel with both hands. The warmth of the heater did not help. His breath still came out in quick bursts, and his thoughts kept returning to the glowing eyes in the forest. He slept very little that night. The storm passed, but the silence stayed. The next morning, Carl drove back toward the same stretch of highway with 2 co-workers from his transport company. They had heard his report and agreed to return with him. The forest looked still, and the sky was clear, but the heavy feeling in the air had not gone. When they reached the place where he had stopped before, they parked and stepped out. Snow covered everything, but parts of the ground near the trees looked strange. There were long, flat shapes pressed into the frozen surface. The shapes were spaced apart in a way that looked unnatural. Each one was larger than a man's foot and sunk deeper into the snow than any boot could. They also saw something else. One tree near the road had long lines running down the trunk. The bark was scraped and hanging loose. The marks were thick, not like claw swipes, but more like pressure had been pushed against it. The tree stood slightly tilted now, as if something had leaned on it with great weight. The men took photos and marked the spot, but no other signs were found. No fur, no droppings, no broken branches from a charging animal. The forest looked untouched, but the strange signs could not be explained. After an hour, they returned to the trucks without speaking much. Carl took time off work for several weeks. He stayed at home, avoided the news, and spoke only to close friends. He kept the lights on during the night and refused to drive after sunset. The thought of returning to any place near deep woods filled him with unease. Even months later, the memory of the glowing eyes made him stop and listen when wind passed through trees near his house. Other drivers began to share quiet stories. Some said they had seen large shapes move across the road in the distance. Others reported strange noises on their radios when driving through that same area. Some trucks lost signal briefly, then returned to normal once past the forest line. No one claimed to have clear proof, but the unease was growing. The company listed Carl's report as a weather-related event. They did not include the footprints or the tree damage in the official file. Local authorities visited the site but gave no public statement. They said it was likely a large bear, though no bear tracks had been found. The strange flat shapes in the snow were ignored. Carl later moved to a different job. He stayed away from long routes and never spoke about the figure again. But his behavior had changed. He checked windows before going to sleep, avoided wooded areas, and never left home without a flashlight. The highway remained open. Trucks still passed through, but fewer drivers stopped along that stretch. Some even adjusted their routes to avoid it. The forest on either side stayed silent. Nothing new was reported. Yet many believed that whatever had been watching Carl that night was still there, just beyond the trees, waiting without sound.